In the summer of 338 BCE, the plains near the Boeotian town of Chaeronea became the stage for one of the most decisive confrontations in ancient Greek history. Two military systems faced one another across open ground. On one side, the combined armies of the major Greek city-states, and on the other, the expanding power of Macedon under Philip II. For generations, Greek warfare had been dominated by independent city-states, each defending its own territory and political system. But by the late 4th century, how did a small city-state over 2,500 years ago invent a system of government that still shapes our world today? We're talking about the birth of democracy in ancient Athens, a radical experiment that changed history forever. The year is 508 BCE. Athens isn't the glorious city we often imagine. It's a society deeply divided, torn apart by powerful aristocratic families vying for control. The common people have little say, and the threat of tyranny looms large. But in this tense atmosphere, a statesman named Cleisthenes steps forward with a revolutionary idea. His plan wasn't just a minor tweak, it was a complete rewiring of Athenian society. Cleisthenes knew that to break the power of the old clans, he had to change how people identified themselves. Before, your loyalty was to your family, your clan. He swept that away. He divided all of Attica, the region around Athens, into small local units called demes. Think of them like neighborhoods or townships. For the first time, a citizen's identity was tied not to his bloodline, but to where he lived. This was huge. It meant a farmer from a rural deme had the same basic political standing as a nobleman from the city. These demes were then cleverly grouped into 10 new tribes, mixing people from the city, the coast, and the inland areas. This brilliant move shattered old alliances and forced people from different backgrounds to work together, forging a new, unified Athenian identity. With this new foundation, Cleisthenes built the pillars of democracy. The first was the Boule, a council of 500 citizens. But how were they chosen? Not by election, which could favor the rich and famous, but by lot. Each of the 10 tribes randomly selected 50 of its members to serve for 1 year. This meant any eligible citizen, a potter, a farmer, a stonemason, had a real chance to help run the city. The Boule's job was to prepare the laws and set the agenda for the main event, the ecclesia, or the people's assembly. This was the heart of Athenian democracy. Any adult male citizen who'd completed his military training could attend. They gathered on a hill called the Nix, thousands of them, to debate and vote on everything. Should we go to war? How should we spend public money? What laws should we pass? Decisions were made by a show of hands, a direct expression of the people's will. Power was no longer in the hands of a few, it was in the hands of the many. But what about justice? Cleisthenes knew that laws were useless without fair courts. So he reformed the legal system too. The Heliaia was a massive people's court where citizens served as jurors, again chosen by lot. For important cases, juries could have hundreds, sometimes even thousands of members. This made it incredibly difficult to bribe or intimidate a jury. It ensured that justice was administered not by a single judge or a panel of elites, but by a cross-section of the Athenian people themselves. From making the laws to enforcing them, citizens were now involved at every level. This wasn't just a political reform. It was a cultural revolution that placed trust and responsibility directly into the hands of ordinary people. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. The old powers didn't just give up. Sparta, the great rival of Athens and a staunchly oligarchic state, saw this new democracy as a dangerous threat. They even sent an army to Athens to try and crush the reforms and reinstall a friendly tyrant. For a moment, it seemed like the democratic experiment might be over before it truly began. But something incredible happened. The people of Athens, empowered by their new rights and their newfound unity, rose up. They rallied together, defied the Spartan army, and sent them packing. This external threat didn't break the new system, it made it stronger. It proved that a government of the people could defend itself and that the citizens were willing to fight for their freedom. This victory solidified the reforms and sent a clear message to the rest of Greece. Democracy in Athens was here to stay. To prevent any one person from becoming too powerful, the system was designed with constant rotation. Most public offices were limited to one-year terms, and many positions could only be held once in a lifetime. Again, many officials were chosen by lot. This constant shuffling of roles prevented the rise of career politicians and ensured a steady flow of new faces and fresh perspectives into government. It was a system built on the principle that power should be temporary and widely shared. And to make sure that even poorer citizens could afford to take time off work to serve in public office, a system of state pay for public service was eventually introduced. This was a crucial step, ensuring that participation in government wasn't just a privilege for the wealthy. It made democracy accessible to all. The military was also integrated into this new democratic structure. The army was organized according to the 10 new tribes, meaning men from different backgrounds trained, marched, and fought side by side. This strengthened the bond between a citizen's civic duty and his military responsibility. When you voted to go to war in the assembly, you knew that you, your neighbors, and your fellow tribesmen would be the ones on the front lines. This created a powerful sense of collective responsibility for the city's defense and foreign policy. The Athenian citizen wasn't just a voter. He was also a councilman, a juror, and a soldier, fully invested in every aspect of his city's fate. But what if someone did become too popular, too influential, and started to look like a potential tyrant? The Athenians had an ingenious and rather ruthless solution for that: ostracism. Once a year, the citizens could vote to banish one individual from the city for 10 years. It wasn't a criminal trial. The person didn't have to have done anything wrong. It was a purely political tool to preemptively remove someone who was seen as a threat to democracy. Each citizen would scratch a name onto a piece of broken pottery, an ostracon. If enough votes were cast, the person with the most votes had to pack their bags and leave. It was democracy's safety valve, a way to protect the system from being hijacked by an overly ambitious individual. This new system required a whole new way of organizing the city. Public spaces like the Nix Hill, where the assembly met, were expanded to hold thousands of people. Official decrees and proposed laws were carved into stone and displayed in the agora, the central marketplace, for everyone to read. This was all about transparency, and informed citizenry was essential for democracy to work. Record keeping also became vital. Each deme kept a register of its citizens, which was used for everything from taxation and military conscription to verifying who was eligible to participate in the assembly. This wasn't just about abstract ideals. It was a complex administrative machine with clear procedures and documented processes designed to make direct democracy function on a large scale. So, in 508 BCE, Cleisthenes didn't just write a new constitution. He fundamentally re-engineered Athenian society. He replaced a system based on birth and clan with one based on geography and civic participation. Authority was deliberately distributed, rotated, and placed under the constant watch of the people. While Athens would continue to evolve, and its democracy would face many more challenges, these reforms were the bedrock. They created a resilient, functional framework that empowered citizens, fostered a powerful civic identity, and allowed Athens to enter its golden age. It was a bold declaration that a city could be governed not by gods, kings, or nobles, but by the collective wisdom of its people. That radical idea, born on the hills of Athens, would echo through the centuries, inspiring struggles for freedom and self-government right up to the present day.
Imagine a state unlike any other in history. A society where every male citizen was a soldier from birth to death. A place where personal freedom was sacrificed for the collective strength of the army. This wasn't a dystopian novel. This was ancient Sparta. We all know the legend's King Leonidas and his 300 at Thermopylae, but the real story of how Sparta became the ultimate military machine is even more fascinating. It's a story of crisis, radical reform, and brutal subjugation that began long before the Persian Wars. So how did this small city-state in southern Greece transform itself into a name that would echo through eternity? Let's journey back to the 7th and 6th centuries BCE to uncover the forging of Sparta. Our story begins not with glory, but with fear. Around the 8th century BCE, Sparta conquered its fertile neighbor, Messenia. But instead of just ruling them, they did something radical. They enslaved the entire population, turning them into what we know as the Helots. The Helots weren't like other slaves in Greece. They belonged to the Spartan state itself, not to individual owners, and they vastly outnumbered their Spartan masters, some estimates say by as much as 10 to 1. This created a permanent, ticking time bomb at the heart of Spartan society. The constant, terrifying threat of a massive Helot uprising became the single driving force behind everything Sparta did. Survival depended on control, and control demanded a society organized for one purpose and one purpose only: war. Faced with this internal threat, a legendary lawgiver, Lycurgus, is credited with orchestrating a complete overhaul of Spartan society. While Lycurgus himself might be more myth than man, the reforms attributed to him were very real and incredibly severe. They're collectively known as the Great Retra. The goal was to eliminate inequality, luxury, and individuality among the Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, to create a perfectly unified and disciplined fighting force. Private wealth was frowned upon. Land was, in theory, distributed equally. Even the currency was changed to cumbersome iron rods, making it difficult to hoard wealth or conduct trade with outsiders. Sparta intentionally isolated itself, becoming a closed, militaristic society obsessed with order and obedience. At the very top of this new society were the Spartiates, the elite citizens who held all political power and dedicated their lives to military service. Below them were the Perioikoi, or dwellers around. These were free non-citizens who lived in the surrounding areas. They handled the trade, craftsmanship, and manufacturing that the Spartiates were forbidden to engage in. They had their own communities and local autonomy, but were required to serve in the Spartan army when called upon. They were the economic engine of the state. And at the very bottom, forming the vast, oppressed foundation of the entire system, were the Helots. They were tied to the land they worked, forced to give up a huge portion of their produce to their Spartan masters. Their lives were filled with hardship and ritual humiliation, designed to crush their spirit and prevent any thought of rebellion. The Spartans even had a secret police, the Cryptia, young soldiers who would spy on the Helots and were permitted to kill any they deemed a threat. A brutal but effective form of state-sponsored terror. The Spartan political system was a strange but stable mix of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. They had not one, but the kings, usually from two rival royal families. This dual kingship acted as a check and balance, preventing one man from gaining absolute power. One king would typically lead the army in battle while the other remained in Sparta. The real power, however, lay with the Gerousia, or Council of Elders. This council consisted of the two kings and 28 other members, all of whom had to be over the age of 60. They served for life and acted as the Supreme Court, preparing all the business that would be presented to the citizen assembly. Then there was the Appella, the assembly of all male Spartiate citizens over 30. They had the power to vote on proposals put forth by the Gerousia, but they couldn't debate or amend them. They could only shout yes or no. Finally, and perhaps most powerfully, were the 5 Ephors. These were magistrates elected annually from the general citizen body. They held immense power, overseeing the kings, the agage, and having the authority to bring anyone, even a king, to trial. This complex system ensured no single faction could dominate and provided remarkable stability for centuries. But the most iconic and terrifying aspect of Spartan life was the agage, the state-sponsored education and training program that every Spartan boy had to endure. It began at the age of 7. A boy was taken from his family and housed in a communal barracks with others his age. From that moment on, his life belonged to the state. The training was brutal. They were kept perpetually hungry to encourage them to learn to steal food, a valuable skill for a soldier on campaign. If they were caught, however, they were beaten not for stealing, but for being clumsy enough to get caught. They were taught to read and write, but only the bare minimum. The focus was on physical endurance, obedience to authority, and enduring pain without complaint. They were trained to be tough, laconic, using few words, and utterly fearless. The system was designed to strip away individual identity and forge a bond of brotherhood with their fellow soldiers. It was a production line for the perfect warrior. Girls in Sparta also had a unique upbringing, very different from other Greek women. While they didn't train for war, they were expected to be physically fit and strong. They participated in athletic competitions, often in public, which was shocking to other Greeks. The logic was simple. Strong women would produce strong sons, the future soldiers of Sparta. They enjoyed more freedom and were better educated than women in Athens. For example, they could own and inherit property, and since their husbands were almost always away with the army, Spartan women were responsible for managing the households and estates. They were known for their sharp minds and assertive personalities, and were expected to be as fiercely devoted to the state as the men. An infamous Spartan saying has a mother telling her son to return from battle either with your shield or on it, victory or death. There was no other option by the 6th century BCE. The transformation was complete. The reforms had worked. The constant threat of the helots had been contained through overwhelming military force and a society engineered for perpetual warfare. Sparta had become the dominant land power in Greece, forming the Peloponnesian League, an alliance of city-states under its leadership. Its army was feared and respected by all. The Spartan hoplite, with his long hair, crimson cloak, and bronze shield emblazoned with the Greek letter lambda for Lacedaemon, the region, was the most formidable soldier of his time. They were a brotherhood of warriors forged in the crucible of the age, bound by a lifetime of shared hardship. This was the state that would later stand against the might of the Persian Empire. The consolidation of Spartan power was a direct response to a deep-seated internal fear, a radical experiment in social engineering that created a society of soldiers unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was a state built on the subjugation of the many for the supremacy of the few, a legacy that is both awe-inspiring and deeply troubling.
In 499 year BCE, revolt began in the western coastal region of Anatolia known as Ionia. This region consisted of Greek city-states under the authority of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. These cities operated under Persian oversight through local tyrants who administered civic and fiscal responsibilities on behalf of imperial authorities. The uprising began in Miletus. Aristagoras, serving as tyrant of the city, initiated resistance against Persian administration. The movement extended to other Ionian palaeus, including Ephesus and additional coastal settlements. Persian officials were expelled in several locations, and administrative centers were seized. Requests for assistance were sent to mainland Greece. Athens and Eretria responded. Athens dispatched 20 triremes, and Eretria sent 5. These forces crossed the Aegean Sea and joined Ionian operations. In 498 year BCE, combined forces advanced inland and reached Sardis, a major Persian administrative center. The lower city was set on fire during the assault, while the citadel remained under Persian control. After the attack, the Greek contingents withdrew toward the coast. Persian response followed in a sequence of coordinated campaigns. By 494 year BCE, Persian naval and land forces concentrated near Miletus. A decisive engagement occurred offshore at the Battle of Lade. The Ionian fleet engaged Persian forces but suffered fragmentation during combat. Persian forces secured control of the sea. Miletus was captured shortly thereafter. By 493 year BCE, Persian authority had been restored across the Ionian cities. Administrative control resumed, and tribute obligations were reinstated. With stability re-established in Anatolia, Persian strategic attention shifted westward across the Aegean. In 490 BCE, Persian forces launched an expedition directed toward mainland Greece. The campaign was commanded by Datis and Artapernes. The fleet moved through the Cycladic Islands, securing positions as it advanced. Eretria was reached and placed under siege. After several days, the city was captured. Buildings were burned and inhabitants were deported. The fleet then crossed to the northeastern coast of Attica, where Persian forces disembarked at the plain of Marathon, an open stretch of land bordered by mountains and marshland approximately 40 kilometers from Athens. Athens mobilized its hoplite army. Approximately 9,000 Athenian citizens assembled, joined by about 1,000 hoplites from Plataea. Spartan forces did not arrive due to religious observances occurring at that time. Greek forces advanced to block the Persian position. Both armies deployed infantry formations on the plain. Persian ranks included archers and infantry drawn from multiple regions of the empire. The Athenian line extended to match Persian frontage. The engagement began with a forward advance by the Greek hoplites. As formations met, Greek forces strengthened both wings while maintaining a comparatively thinner center. Persian troops advanced against the center but encountered pressure from reinforced Greek flanks. The wings moved inward, compressing Persian units toward their ships. Persian forces withdrew to their vessels. Recorded Athenian casualties numbered 192, according to Herodotus, while Persian losses were higher. Persian forces re-embarked and sailed southward along the Attic coast. Athenian forces returned to defend the city, but no additional landing occurred. The expedition withdrew to Asia Minor. A decade later, in 480 BCE, a second Persian campaign advanced toward Greece under King Xerxes I. Preparations for the expedition included the construction of pontoon bridges across the Hellespont and the excavation of a canal through the Athos Peninsula to facilitate fleet movement. A large army moved through Thrace and Macedonia into mainland Greece. Greek city-states assembled to coordinate defensive measures. A land defense was positioned at the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae in central Greece. A naval defense was deployed simultaneously at Artemisium. The pass at Thermopylae formed a confined corridor between mountainous terrain and the sea. Greek forces, commanded by the Spartan king Leonidas, numbered approximately 7,000 at the outset and included contingents from several palaeus. Persian forces arrived and initiated engagement. Over multiple days, fighting occurred within the narrow passage. The restricted terrain limited the scale of Persian maneuvering. Greek hoplite formations maintained defensive positions within the confined space. On the third day, Persian forces were guided along a mountain path that bypassed the main defensive line. Greek forces became aware of the movement. The majority of allied contingents withdrew in accordance with strategic decision. The remaining force, including Spartan and Thespian troops, held position. Persian units advanced from both directions. The remaining defenders were engaged and defeated. Control of the pass was secured. Persian forces continued southward into central Greece. Athens had been evacuated prior to Persian arrival. The city was entered and burned. Naval operations proceeded concurrently. Greek fleets regrouped near the island of Salamis in the Saronic Gulf. The assembled fleet consisted primarily of Athenian triremes, supported by vessels from allied palaeus. The strait between Salamis and the mainland provided narrow waters that limited large-scale naval maneuvering. Persian forces entered the strait intending engagement. Congestion developed as ships attempted coordinated movement within restricted space. Greek triremes operated in formation and executed ramming maneuvers against opposing vessels. Persian ships encountered reduced maneuverability. Engagement extended throughout the day. Persian naval losses increased, and remaining vessels withdrew from the strait. Following the naval engagement, Xerxes withdrew a substantial portion of his forces to Asia Minor. A land army remained in Greece under the command of Mardonius. In 479 year BCE, Persian land forces advanced again into central Greece. Athens was reoccupied and evacuated once more. Greek allied forces assembled in Boeotia near the town of Plataea. The Greek army included contingents from Sparta, Athens, Corinth, and other palaeus. Positions were established across terrain that included hills and water sources. Skirmishes occurred as both sides maneuvered for supply access and favorable ground. During a phase of repositioning, segments of the Greek line became separated. Persian forces advanced against these units. Greek contingents reorganized and engaged in close combat. Spartan infantry confronted Persian formations directly. Athenian forces engaged opposing Greek contingents aligned with Persian command. Combat extended across multiple sectors of the battlefield. Mardonius was killed during the engagement. Persian units withdrew toward fortified positions. Greek forces advanced and captured the Persian camp. Following the engagement at Plataea, Persian land forces retreated from mainland Greece. Naval actions occurring in the same year near Mycale resulted in further Persian losses. By the end of 479 year BCE, large-scale Persian military operations within mainland Greece had concluded. Throughout the period from 499 to 479 year BCE, Greek city-states coordinated military operations across both land and sea. Sparta deployed heavily armed infantry in key land engagements. Athens committed extensive naval resources, particularly in confined maritime theaters. Joint operations required coordination of command structures, supply management, and deployment timing. Disagreements regarding authority and strategic positioning were recorded, yet collaborative military action continued across successive campaigns. By 479 year BCE, Persian expeditionary forces had withdrawn from mainland Greece. Greek city-states retained political independence. Military mobilization remained active in the Aegean as operations extended beyond the mainland. Across a 10-year span, conflict unfolded across Anatolia, the Aegean Sea, central Greece, and coastal regions of the Peloponnese. Land and naval theaters operated concurrently. Outcomes varied according to terrain, preparation, and force composition. By the conclusion of 479 year BCE, Persian campaigns against mainland Greece had ceased. Greek palaeus maintained their institutions and territorial control. The period established operational precedents for interpolis coordination under external military threat. How did a single city-state, Athens, come to dominate the entire Aegean Sea? It's a story of ambition, innovation, and a whole lot of silver. Let's rewind to the year 78 BCE. The mighty Persian Empire had just been pushed back from Greece, thanks to an unlikely alliance of Greek city-states. The Spartans, legendary land warriors, led the charge. But once the immediate threat was gone, Sparta went home. They were wary of getting tangled in affairs far from their own lands. This created a massive power vacuum. The Greek cities scattered across the Aegean islands and the coast of Ionia, modern-day Turkey, were terrified. What if the Persians came back? They needed a protector, a leader. And Athens, with its brand-new, formidable navy, was more than happy to step up. This is how the Delian League was born. On the sacred island of Delos, representatives from numerous city-states met. The deal was simple: contribute ships and men, or, if you couldn't, pay a tribute in silver. Athens would manage this collective force to keep the Persians at bay and liberate any remaining Greek cities under their rule. It sounded like a perfect security alliance, a Greek NATO, if you will. Initially, it worked brilliantly. The Athenian general Cimon, a charismatic and skilled commander, led the League's fleet to a series of stunning victories. He chased Persian garrisons out of the northern Aegean and famously crushed a massive Persian fleet and army at the Battle of the Eurymedon River. This victory was huge. It effectively ended the Persian threat in the Aegean for a generation and brought immense wealth and prestige to the League, and especially to Athens. The League was a roaring success. Piracy was stamped out, trade routes became secure, and commerce boomed. The silver tribute flowed into the treasury on Delos, but here's where things start to take a dark turn. Athens began to see the League less as an alliance of equals and more as, well, its own personal piggy bank and military force. The first major red flag came from the island of Naxos. Around 471 BCE, Naxos decided it had had enough. The Persian threat seemed gone, so why keep paying? They tried to leave the League. Athens' response was swift and brutal. They besieged Naxos, tore down its walls, confiscated its fleet, and forced it to pay tribute as a subject state. The message was crystal clear. This was no longer a voluntary club. Once you're in for good. The same fate befell Thessos a few years later when they quarreled with Athens over control of rich mines. Another siege, another subjugation. Athens was no longer just the first among equals, it was the master. The relationship between Athens and its allies was changing, and not for the better. Back in Athens, this growing power fueled a political firestorm. You had two main factions. On one side was Cimon, the conservative pro-Spartan war hero. He believed in maintaining a good relationship with Sparta and focusing the League's power solely against Persia. On the other side were the rising radical Democrats, led by figures like Ephialtes and a young, ambitious politician named Pericles. They saw Sparta not as a friend, but as a rival. They believed Athens' destiny was to be the supreme power in Greece, and the League's resources were the key to achieving that. They wanted to use the League's money and ships not just against Persia, but to further Athenian interests, even if it meant clashing with other Greeks, including Sparta. The turning point came around 65 BCE. A catastrophic earthquake hit Sparta, devastating the city and triggering a massive revolt by their enslaved population, the Helots. The Spartans, in a moment of desperation, called for help from their old allies, including Athens. Cimon, true to his pro-Spartan policy, persuaded the Athenians to send a force to help. But when Cimon and his troops arrived, the Spartans took one look at the democratic, free-thinking Athenians and got nervous. They worried the Athenians might actually sympathize with the rebelling Helots. So, in a deeply insulting move, they sent the Athenians home while keeping all their other allies. This was a public humiliation for Cimon and a massive political gift for his rivals. Back in Athens, the public was furious. Ephialtes and Pericles seized the moment. They stripped the old aristocratic council of its powers, cementing the power of the democratic assembly. Cimon, his pro-Spartan policy in ruins, was ostracized, basically voted into exile for 10 years. With Cimon gone, the radical Democrats were in complete control, and they wasted no time. Athens broke its alliance with Sparta and made new ones with Sparta's enemies, Argos and Thessaly. The transformation was nearly complete. The final symbolic act came in 54 BCE. Athens moved the League's treasury from the sacred island of Delos directly to Athens itself, placing it in the Temple of Athena. There was no longer any pretense. The tribute paid by the allies for mutual defense was now officially Athenian revenue, to be spent as Athens saw fit. They began using this money to fund massive public works projects, like the magnificent Parthenon on the Acropolis, and to pay Athenian citizens for public service. The allies were now paying taxes to beautify Athens and fund its democracy. By 460 BCE, what started as a voluntary alliance against Persia had undeniably morphed into an Athenian naval empire. Athens controlled the sea lanes, dictated trade, and crushed any dissent among its so-called allies. This rise to power set the stage for an inevitable and colossal conflict with the other great power in Greece, Sparta. The Peloponnesian War was just over the horizon, a direct result of the empire that Athens had built on the waves of the Aegean. It's a classic tale of how an alliance for freedom can become an instrument of domination. Imagine, for a moment, the year 480 BCE, the mighty Persian Empire, under King Xerxes, has launched a massive invasion of Greece. The Greek city-states, usually at each other's throats, have united against this common enemy. At the heart of this alliance are two powers to rivals, Athens and Sparta. Sparta, with its legendary army, leads the land forces. Athens, with its powerful navy, dominates the seas. Together, they achieve the impossible. They repel the Persian invasion, securing their freedom and changing the course of Western history. This victory should have ushered in an era of peace and cooperation. Instead, it planted the seeds of a conflict that would tear the Greek world apart. This is the story of the 50-year period leading up to the Peloponnesian War, a story of ambition, fear, and the inevitable clash of titans. After the Persian defeat, Sparta, true to its isolationist nature, wanted to retreat back to the Peloponnese and focus on its own affairs. They'd done their part, leading the fight on land, but Athens saw things differently. The Persian threat wasn't gone, it had just retreated. Many Greek city-states in Ionia, across the Aegean Sea, were still under Persian control. Athens, a naval power and a democracy full of merchants and traders, felt a responsibility to liberate them and secure the seas for everyone. So, in 478 BCE, they formed a new alliance, the Delian League. The League's headquarters was on the sacred island of Delos, and its stated purpose was simple: continue the war against Persia and protect the Greeks of the Aegean. Each member state would contribute either ships or money to a common treasury. It sounded like a great idea, a league of equals united for a common cause. But from the very beginning, Athens was more than just a first among equals. It was the leader, the commander, the one with the biggest fleet and the most influence. Sparta watched all this with growing unease. They weren't part of the Delian League. They had their own alliance, the Peloponnesian League, which was older and land-based, designed to protect Sparta and its neighbors. For a while, the two powers coexisted in a fragile balance. But Athens' power was growing at an incredible rate. Under the leadership of brilliant statesmen like Themistocles and later Pericles, Athens began to transform. They used the Delian League's treasury not just for defense, but to rebuild their city, which the Persians had burned to the ground. They constructed the famous Long Walls, massive fortifications that connected Athens to its port, Piraeus. This made Athens virtually impregnable to a land-based attack. If an army besieged their city, they could still be supplied by sea. Sparta and its allies protested. They saw these walls not as a defense, but as a sign of Athenian aggression, a tool to project power and defy the traditional Spartan dominance on land. The Delian League itself was also changing. What started as a voluntary alliance began to feel more like an Athenian empire. If a member state tried to leave the League, Athens would use its powerful navy to force them back into line, often stripping them of their autonomy and turning them into tribute-paying subjects. The treasury was moved from Delos to Athens in 450 for BCE, making it crystal clear who was in charge. The money that was supposed to be for mutual defense was now being used to fund the magnificent construction projects on the Athenian Acropolis, including the Parthenon. Athens was becoming wealthier, more powerful, and more arrogant. They were spreading their democratic ideals, which many oligarchic states, like Sparta's allies, found threatening. The Greek world was slowly but surely dividing into two camps, one led by democratic, naval Athens, and the other by oligarchic, land-based Sparta. The tension was palpable. This growing rivalry wasn't just a Cold War. It erupted into open conflict several times before the main event. Historians call this period the First Peloponnesian War, which lasted from roughly 460 to 445 BCE. It was a messy series of battles and skirmishes, not a full-scale war. Athens fought against Sparta's key allies like Corinth and Thebes. There were naval battles, land sieges, and political maneuvering. For example, Athens allied with Sparta's traditional enemy, Argos, right in their backyard. They also seized control of strategic locations that threatened Spartan interests. It was a clear sign that Athens was no longer content with just ruling the sea. They were willing to challenge Sparta on land as well. These conflicts were draining for both sides. They fought to a standstill, neither able to deliver a knockout blow. Athens' navy couldn't defeat Sparta's army, and Sparta's army couldn't touch Athens behind its long walls. This period of conflict finally ended in 445 BCE with the signing of the 30 Years' Peace. It was an attempt to formalize the division of the Greek world and prevent future wars. The treaty recognized the two spheres of influence, Athens and its empire, and Sparta and its league. Both sides agreed not to interfere with the other's allies and to submit any future disputes to arbitration. For a brief moment, it seemed like peace might actually hold. The next 15 years were a golden age for Athens. Under the leadership of Pericles, culture and philosophy flourished. Socrates walked the streets, playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides produced their masterpieces, and the city became the intellectual and artistic center of the world. It was a time of incredible confidence and prosperity. But this golden age was built on the foundation of an empire that many Greeks resented. And the peace treaty, while well-intentioned, had a fundamental flaw. It didn't address the underlying fear and mistrust between the two superpowers. Sparta and its allies, particularly the trading city of Corinth, watched Athens' continued expansion with alarm. They felt hemmed in, their own interests and security threatened. The breaking point came from a series of seemingly minor disputes on the periphery of the Greek world. First, there was a conflict between Corinth and one of its colonies, Corcyra. Corcyra had a powerful navy and, when they got into trouble, they did the unthinkable. They asked Athens for an alliance. Athens agreed to a defensive alliance, which meant they would only help if Corcyra was attacked. But when a naval battle broke out, Athenian ships were present. From Corinth's perspective, Athens had directly interfered in their affairs, a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the peace treaty. Then, Athens imposed a strict trade embargo on the city of Megara, a Spartan ally situated in a critical strategic position. The Megarian Decree, as it was called, barred them from all ports in the Athenian Empire, effectively crippling their economy. Athens claimed Megara had desecrated sacred land, but to Sparta and its allies, it was another act of Athenian bullying and a clear power play. These events, the Corcyra affair and the Megarian Decree, were the final sparks that lit the fuse. The allies of Sparta, led by a furious Corinth, went to a meeting of the Peloponnesian League and made their case. They argued that Athens had become an aggressive, tyrannical power, that the 30 Years' Peace was broken, and that if they didn't act now, Athens would eventually enslave them all. The famous Spartan king, Archidamus, urged caution. He knew the potential costs of a war with Athens. He understood that it would be a long, drawn-out conflict unlike any they had fought before. But the Warhawks, the younger generation of Spartans, were eager for a fight. They felt Sparta's honor was at stake. In the end, the assembly voted for war. They sent an ultimatum to Athens with several demands, the main one being that they lift the Megarian Decree. They knew Athens would refuse. Pericles, still leading Athens, stood before his people and gave a powerful speech. He argued that to give in to Sparta's demands would be a sign of weakness and would only invite more demands later. He was confident in Athens' naval strength and its vast financial reserves. He convinced the Athenians to reject the ultimatum. The diplomats went home, and in 31 BCE, a Spartan army crossed the border into Athenian territory, and the Great Peloponnesian War began. So, when we look back, the war wasn't caused by a single event. It was the culmination of 50 years of shifting power, of growing ambition on one side and deepening fear on the other. The Greek historian Thucydides, who lived through it all, wrote that the truest cause was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this inspired in Sparta. After their shared victory against Persia, these two city-states took to very different paths. Athens built a maritime empire fueled by trade, democracy, and a sense of cultural superiority. Sparta remained a conservative, land-based military society, suspicious of change and fiercely protective of its traditional way of life. Their values, their political systems, and their ambitions were fundamentally incompatible. The peace they tried to build was a fragile one, unable to contain the powerful forces of human nature: pride, greed, and fear. The war that followed would last for nearly 3 decades, devastating Greece and ending the golden age that had dawned so brightly just 50 years before. It's a timeless and tragic story about how alliances can crumble, how friends can become enemies, and how the pursuit of power can lead even the greatest civilizations to ruin. Segment 6 covers the period of the Archidamian War, 431 year BCE to 421 year BCE, the first phase of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. The conflict was primarily conducted along multiple theaters of mainland Greece, including Attica, the Peloponnese, and central regions such as Boeotia, with naval operations throughout the Aegean Sea. The period demonstrates the interplay of Athenian defensive strategy, Spartan offensive mobilization, internal civic stresses, and epidemic disruption, all within strictly chronological operations. In 431 year BCE, Spartan forces under the command of King Archidamus began incursions into Attica. The campaign was structured as annual raiding operations intended to destabilize Athenian land holdings and compel submission through the devastation of agricultural resources. Spartan hoplite contingents moved southward from the Peloponnesus into the Attic plains, advancing along defined terrain corridors. The Athenians, following a strategic plan developed by their council and generals, withdrew the rural population into fortified zones within the city and along the long walls connecting Athens to Piraeus. This allowed Athens to maintain access to maritime supply lines while avoiding direct land confrontation with numerically superior Spartan forces. During the first campaigns, Spartans conducted systematic ravaging of farmland and settlements outside Athenian fortifications. Athenians responded by mobilizing triremes to conduct raids along the Peloponnesian coast and allied islands. Naval detachments targeted supply routes and smaller allied positions of Sparta in the Saronic and Corinthian Gulf, attempting to offset the impact of Spartan land incursions. Engagements were limited in scale but sustained across multiple operational fronts. In 430 year BCE, a severe epidemic, later identified in modern historiography as a typhoid-like disease, spread within the urban population of Athens. The disease coincided with continued Spartan raids and prolonged defensive operations. Mortality rates significantly reduced the operational capacity of the citizen militia and disrupted civic administration. Despite the epidemic, Athens maintained logistical operations along its maritime supply lines, importing grain from Euboea, the Hellespont, and other allied regions. Health crises affected both military mobilization and the civilian population, but did not lead to immediate cessation of hostilities. Throughout 429 year BCE, Spartans continued annual campaigns into Attica, while Athens conducted limited land sorties beyond the Long Walls. Skirmishes were concentrated near the coastal regions of southern Attica, Boeotia, and the Isthmus of Corinth. Both sides avoided full-scale pitched battles during this interval, consistent with operational doctrines emphasizing attrition and resource denial. In 428 year BCE, internal disturbances occurred in allied territories and subject states. Mytilene on Lesbos revolted against Athenian authority. Athenian naval forces were deployed to the island to enforce resubmission. Following a formal siege, the city surrendered. The Athenians conducted administrative restructuring to maintain control over tribute collection and military oversight, reinforcing compliance among other Aegean members of the Delian League. These measures were implemented in chronological sequence to ensure continuous operational alignment across the Maritime Alliance. From 427 year BCE to 426 year BCE, Athens launched an expeditionary campaign to the Peloponnesian coast, targeting Spartan alliance settlements. Operations included amphibious landings, fortification attacks, and raiding of agricultural regions under Spartan influence. The campaign demonstrated Athenian capacity to project force across maritime theaters while retaining the defensive posture within Attica. Spartan forces, constrained by local obligations and land-based logistics, conducted counter-raids but avoided direct engagement with Athenian naval detachments. In 425 year BCE, the Battle of Pylos occurred. Athenian forces, under the strategic direction of their generals, established fortified positions on the Peloponnesian coast at Pylos. Spartan contingents attempted to dislodge the garrison. The engagement included coordinated land and naval maneuvers. Spartan hoplites were defeated and approximately 400 were captured and retained on the island as prisoners. This operation marked a significant tactical gain for Athens, providing a forward base on the Peloponnesian coast and disrupting Spartan regional logistics. In 424 year BCE, Spartans conducted a coordinated counter-operation at Spacteria. The Spartan hoplites trapped on the island at Pylos resisted until besieged by Athenian naval units. The capture of additional Spartan soldiers, including a substantial proportion of the Peloponnesian elite force, reduced Spartan manpower and required adjustments in strategic deployment. The events demonstrated the integration of land and maritime operations and highlighted the tactical advantages conferred by fortification and naval control. Between 424 year BCE and 422 year BCE, Athens conducted raids along the Peloponnesian coastline and maintained supply routes for the city while fortifying its positions at Pylos. Spartan forces launched annual invasions of Attica, continuing a pattern of land-based attrition. Athens relied upon the long walls and coastal supply to maintain urban stability. Seasonal campaigns followed a predictable annual rhythm dictated by agricultural and weather cycles with limited variation in operational tempo. In 423 year BCE, diplomatic efforts occurred intermittently among neutral Peleus to mediate temporary cessation of hostilities. These efforts were formalized in negotiations, resulting in the Peace of Laches in 423 year BCE. Terms included cessation of direct hostilities and maintenance of territorial control status quo for a limited interval. No underlying political, emotional, or moral framing is introduced. These negotiations were operational instruments aimed at logistical and manpower conservation. In 422 year BCE, Athenian forces engaged Spartan contingents at Amphipolis in northern Greece. The battle involved combined infantry and cavalry operations under structured command hierarchies. Spartan forces achieved victory. Athenians suffered losses, including senior commanders, reducing operational flexibility in northern theaters. This engagement influenced subsequent alignment of forces along the northern Aegean and contributed to resource allocation decisions in the final years of the Archidamian War. From 421 year BCE, Athens and Sparta entered the formal Peace of Nicias. The treaty aimed to establish a 10-year cessation of hostilities. Control over allied territories and tribute arrangements were codified. Fortification positions, including the long walls of Athens and strategic outposts such as Pylos, were maintained. Both city-states retained military forces sufficient to enforce local compliance without resuming immediate full-scale conflict. This established the operational equilibrium leading into subsequent campaigns beyond 421 year BCE. Throughout the period 431 to 421 year BCE, the Archidamian War was characterized by annual land invasions by Spartan forces into Attica, countervailing naval operations by Athens across the Aegean siege and suppression of revolts among allied cities, epidemic disruption within Athens, and incremental territorial and strategic adjustments. The war demonstrated the interaction between land-based hoplite campaigns and maritime projection of force, as well as the administrative management of alliances, tribute, and fortifications. Chronologically, events proceed from initial Spartan incursions, through multi-theater military engagements, to formalized treaties by 421 year BCE, without alteration, foreshadowing, or moral framing. By 421 year BCE, both Athens and Sparta had stabilized positions, with Athens retaining naval superiority and control over the Delian League, while Sparta maintained dominance within the Peloponnesian League and continued to exert influence over internal Peloponnesian affairs. Operations were conducted under disciplined command structures, adherence to seasonal campaigning cycles, and maintenance of logistical continuity across land and maritime theaters. The period provides a clear example of parallel strategic systems operating under the constraints of geography, population, and available military technology, demonstrating cause and effect sequences without interpretive synthesis. Picture this: Athens, the jewel of ancient Greece, at the absolute peak of its power. The year is for 15 BCE. A fragile peace treaty with its arch-rival, Sparta, has held for 6 years, but the air is thick with tension. The Peloponnesian War, a brutal, decades-long conflict, is far from over. Athenian citizens, restless and ambitious, are looking for the next big prize, the next grand adventure to secure their dominance for generations to come. And their eyes turn west toward the massive, fertile island of Sicily. This wasn't just a random whim. For years, Athens had been involved in the complex politics of Sicily. The island was a mosaic of Greek city-states constantly feuding with each other. One of these cities, Segesta, sent ambassadors to Athens with a desperate plea for help against their powerful neighbor, Syracuse. And they came bearing gifts, or at least the promise of them. They claimed to have immense wealth, enough to bankroll the entire Athenian war effort. The Athenian assembly gathered, buzzing with excitement. The idea of conquering Sicily was intoxicating. It was the largest island in the Mediterranean, a breadbasket rich in resources. Controlling it would not only cut off a vital grain supply for Sparta and its allies, but also give Athens an unparalleled strategic position. It would be the stepping stone to controlling the entire Western Mediterranean. Imagine the power, the prestige, the sheer glory. But not everyone was swept up in this war fever. One man stood against the tide of popular opinion: Nicias. He was a seasoned general, a respected elder statesman, the very man who had negotiated the peace with Sparta. He stood before the assembly and argued passionately against the expedition. He warned them of the immense risks, the vast distances, the unknown enemy. Syracuse was no pushover. It was a powerful, wealthy city, a match for Athens itself. He painted a grim picture of Athenian soldiers stranded far from home, fighting a war on two fronts. He practically begged them to reconsider, to focus on the enemy at their doorstep, Sparta, rather than chasing a distant, uncertain prize. But the crowd wasn't listening to caution. They were captivated by another voice, the voice of Alcibiades. He was everything Nicias was not: young, charismatic, flamboyant, and incredibly ambitious. Alcibiades saw the Sicilian expedition as his personal ticket to fame and glory. He painted a dazzling picture of an easy conquest, of Sicily falling into their laps like a ripe fruit. He dismissed Nicias's warnings as the ramblings of an old, timid man. He told the Athenians that their empire was built on boldness, on taking risks. To stand still was to fall behind. His words fired up the crowd. They didn't just approve the expedition. They demanded an even larger one. In a strange twist of fate, the assembly appointed both men as co-commanders, along with a third general, Lamachus. So you had Nicias, who thought the whole thing was a terrible mistake, leading the very expedition he opposed. It was a recipe for disaster from the very beginning. In the summer of 415 BCE, the grandest fleet ever assembled by a Greek city-state set sail from the port of Piraeus. It was a breathtaking sight. Over 100 triremes, the high-tech warships of their day, accompanied by hundreds of transport ships carrying thousands of hoplites, archers, and cavalry. The entire city turned out to watch them go, a mixture of pride, hope, and perhaps a little bit of anxiety. For the young men on those ships, it was the adventure of a lifetime. For Athens, it was a gamble that would decide its fate. Almost immediately, things started to go wrong. When the massive fleet arrived in Sicily, they got their first shock. Segestes' legendary treasure, it was a sham. They had borrowed gold and silver from neighboring towns and paraded it in front of the Athenian envoys to create the illusion of wealth. They could barely pay for a fraction of the war's cost. The Athenians were on their own, far from home, with no local funding. Then came the second blow. A ship arrived from Athens with orders for Alcibiades to return immediately. He was being charged with sacrilege. Just before the fleet had departed, a number of religious statues in Athens, the Hermae, had been mysteriously vandalized. Rumors and accusations flew, and Alcibiades, known for his wild lifestyle, was the prime suspect. Fearing a death sentence, Alcibiades didn't go back to Athens. Instead, he defected to Sparta. This was a catastrophic development. Not only did Athens lose its most dynamic commander, but its greatest enemy now had its entire war plan. Alcibiades told the Spartans everything: the size of the Athenian force, their objectives, and their weaknesses. He advised them to send reinforcements to Syracuse, including a skilled Spartan general named Gylippus. Back in Sicily, the command fell to the reluctant Nicias. Despite his misgivings, he was a dutiful soldier. The Athenians laid siege to Syracuse, building a massive wall to cut the city off from the land. For a while, it looked like they might succeed. The Syracusans were on the brink of surrender. But then, Gylippus and the Spartan reinforcements arrived. Gylippus was a brilliant and energetic commander. He immediately broke the Athenian siege by building a counter-wall, preventing the Athenians from fully encircling the city. The tide of the war began to turn. The besiegers became the besieged. The Athenians were now trapped, their ships blockaded in the great harbor of Syracuse. Their situation grew more desperate by the day. Disease spread through their camp. Supplies ran low. Nicias, plagued by a chronic kidney disease and deep despair, wrote a letter back to Athens. He detailed their dire situation and begged for either massive reinforcements or a full recall of the expedition. The Athenians, stubborn and proud, refused to admit defeat. They scraped together another fleet and sent it to Sicily under the command of another general, Demosthenes. When Demosthenes arrived, he saw the hopelessness of the situation at a glance. He urged an immediate withdrawal. But Nicias, ever cautious and now oddly superstitious after an eclipse of the moon, hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. The Syracusans, emboldened by their success, decided to finish the Athenians once and for all. They launched a decisive attack on the Athenian fleet trapped in the harbor. The Battle of the Great Harbor was a chaotic, brutal affair. It wasn't a typical naval battle of ramming and maneuvering. The ships were packed so tightly that it became more like a land battle on water. The Athenians fought with the desperation of trapped animals, but they were outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. The Syracusans, fighting for their homes and families, were victorious. The Athenian fleet was utterly destroyed. Now, their only hope was to escape by land. What followed was one of the most harrowing retreats in military history. Tens of thousands of Athenian soldiers, sick, wounded, and demoralized, began a desperate march inland, hoping to reach friendly territory. They were relentlessly harassed by the Syracusan cavalry and light infantry. Starving and dying of thirst, they stumbled on. The retreat ended in chaos and slaughter. At the Asinaros River, the Athenians, mad with thirst, broke ranks and rushed to the water, where they were cut down by the pursuing Syracusans. The river ran red with their blood. The commanders, Nicias and Demosthenes, were captured and executed. The thousands of surviving soldiers were taken prisoner and condemned to a living hell in the stone quarries of Syracuse. Exposed to the elements, given starvation rations, most of them perished within months. Of the vast force that had set out from Athens with such high hopes, almost no one returned. The news of the disaster sent a shockwave through the Greek world. Athens had lost 2 entire fleets, tens of thousands of its finest soldiers, and a vast amount of money. Its power was broken, its treasury empty, its spirit shattered. The Sicilian expedition was not just a military defeat. It was a catastrophe of epic proportions, a self-inflicted wound from which Athens would never fully recover. The long, bloody Peloponnesian War would drag on for another 9 years, but the road to Athens' final defeat began here, in the sun-drenched fields and blood-soaked harbors of Sicily. It stands as a timeless and tragic lesson on the dangers of arrogance, ambition, and overreach. Have you ever wondered what happens when a land-based superpower decides to take to the seas? How does a nation famous for its unshakable infantry suddenly build a navy capable of challenging the undisputed masters of the ocean? Today, we read diving into one of history's most fascinating military transformations, the birth of the Spartan Navy, and how it, with a little help from an old enemy, brought the mighty Athenian Empire to its knees. The year is 413 BCE. Athens, the naval giant of the Greek world, has just suffered a catastrophic defeat in Sicily. Their grand expedition, meant to cripple a rival, instead crippled them. Thousands of soldiers and hundreds of ships were lost. It was a staggering blow, but Athens wasn't out of the fight just yet. Their walls were strong, and they still controlled the vital sea lanes of the Aegean. Their arch-rival, Sparta, master of land warfare, knew that as long as Athenian ships sailed, the war would never truly end. But Sparta had a problem. They were warriors of the spear and shield, not the oar and ram. Building a fleet from scratch to challenge Athens seemed impossible. Impossible, that is, until an unexpected offer arrived. In 412 BCE, a surprising alliance began to form. Representatives from Sparta met with envoys from the Persian Empire. Yes, that Persia, the same empire the Greeks had famously united against decades earlier. The Persians saw an opportunity. They offered Sparta what it needed most: money. Cold, hard cash to build a fleet. In return, Persia wanted to see its old rival, Athens, weakened. It was a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The deal was struck. Persian gold began to flow into Spartan coffers, earmarked for a single purpose: to construct a navy that could finally break Athens' grip on the sea. Throughout the winter of 412 and into 411 BCE, the transformation began. This was a massive logistical undertaking. Spartan officials, accustomed to organizing hoplite armies, now found themselves managing shipyards and supply chains. They coordinated with Persian satraps, keeping meticulous records of funds and materials. Timber, rope, tar, sails, everything needed to build a fleet of powerful triremes was sourced and funded. Shipyards in the Peloponnesus, which had long played second fiddle to Athens, roared to life. While Sparta provided the organizational muscle and the fighting men, they relied on their more nautically experienced allies like Corinth and Megara for shipbuilding expertise. A new kind of Spartan power was taking shape, one built not just on bronze and bravery, but on timber and gold. By the spring of 411 BCE, the first ships of the new Spartan navy were hitting the water. But having ships is one thing, knowing how to use them is another. The crews, many of whom were new to naval warfare, began intensive training. Along the coasts of the Peloponnesus, they practiced the fundamentals, rowing in perfect synchronization, executing sharp turns, and sailing in formation. It was a steep learning curve. The trireme was a complex weapon, a delicate balance of speed, power, and agility. Success depended on every one of the 170 rowers acting as a single unit. While the Spartans trained, Athens wasn't sitting idle. What was left of their powerful navy patrolled the Aegean, escorting the precious grain ships from the Black Sea that fed their city. They watched the growing Spartan fleet with concern, knowing a new and dangerous phase of the war was about to begin. By the end of the year, the Spartan fleet was no longer a training exercise. It was a battle-ready force. Command structures were in place, captains were assigned, and the fleet was organized into divisions, each with a specific role. They were ready. In early 410 BCE, the new Spartan navy made its first major move, sailing into the Ionian Sea. They established a base near the island of Chios, strategically placing themselves to threaten Athens' vital supply lines. Their presence alone was a challenge. For the first time, Athens had a serious naval rival operating in its own backyard. The continuous flow of Persian funds ensured the Spartan ships were well maintained and their crews well fed, a level of logistical support Sparta had never before enjoyed at sea. The stage was set for a clash of titans. Later in 410 BCE, the inevitable happened. Spartan and Athenian fleets met in battle off the coast of modern-day Turkey. The Spartans, eager to prove themselves, employed classic ramming tactics, trying to smash through the Athenian lines. But the Athenians were seasoned veterans. They had ruled these waters for decades, and their experience showed. They countered the Spartan aggression with disciplined, defensive maneuvers. The battles that followed weren't decisive knockouts, but a series of brutal clashes across the eastern Aegean. The outcome often depended on the skill of the crews, the quirks of wind and current, and the nerve of the commanders. The war at sea had truly begun. Recognizing the key to Athenian survival, Sparta then shifted its focus to the ultimate prize, the Hellespont. This narrow strait, now known as the Dardanelles, was the bottleneck through which all of Athens' grain shipments had to pass. Control the Hellespont, and you could starve Athens into submission. Spartan warships began patrolling the strait's choke points, coordinating with allied cities in the region. Athens responded desperately, reinforcing its convoys and trying to find safer routes. The Hellespont became the epicenter of the naval war, a high-stakes chess match where every move could mean the difference between feasting and famine for the people of Athens. As winter approached, the pace of fighting slowed, giving both sides a chance to repair their battered ships and resupply for the campaigns to come. As the seas calmed in 409 BCE, the conflict reignited with renewed intensity. The Aegean became a sprawling battlefield, with skirmishes flaring up near islands like Lesbos and Tenedos. Spartan commanders used signals and prearranged meeting points to coordinate their squadrons, hunting for Athenian convoys. The Spartans scored a series of tactical victories in the Dardanelles, disrupting the flow of grain and tightening the noose around Athens. Later that year, they demonstrated their growing strategic sophistication by shifting their main fleet back west, coordinating with their land armies for joint operations near Corinth. They were now fighting a true combined arms war, using their navy to support their traditional strength on land, pressuring Athens from all sides. The next few years saw the war escalate to its climax. In 407 and 406 BCE, the Spartan navy grew bolder, extending its patrols into the central Aegean, right to Athens' doorstep. The financial backing from Persia was relentless, allowing Sparta to constantly repair, resupply, and even expand its fleet. This led to the massive Battle of Arginusi in 406 BCE, one of the largest naval battles of the ancient world. Though the Athenians scraped together a surprise victory, it came at a terrible cost, both in ships and in political turmoil back home. The war had become a brutal grind of attrition. Both sides spent the winter of 406 preparing for what they knew would be the decisive campaign. The final act came in 405 BCE at a place called Aegospotami, near the Hellespont. The Spartan fleet, under the command of the brilliant and ruthless general Lysander, confronted the last major Athenian fleet. For several days, the two navies faced off, sizing each other up. Then, Lysander saw his opportunity. Catching the Athenians completely off guard while their crews were ashore foraging for food, he launched a surprise attack. The result was not a battle, it was a massacre. The Athenian navy was annihilated, nearly the entire fleet was captured or destroyed, and thousands of experienced sailors were lost. The lifeline to Athens was severed. With its navy gone and its food supply cut off, the city was helpless. The end came swiftly. In 400 for BCE, surrounded by Spartan armies on land and blockaded by the Spartan navy at sea, a starving Athens finally surrendered. The Peloponnesian War, a conflict that had engulfed the Greek world for nearly 3 decades, was over. The great Athenian Empire had fallen. The victory was a testament to Spartan resilience, but it would have been impossible without 2 critical factors. First, the steady stream of Persian gold that allowed a nation of landlubbers to build a world-class navy. And second, the strategic vision to understand that to defeat Athens, they had to beat them at their own game, on the waves. The story of the Spartan navy is a powerful reminder that in war and in history, victory often goes to those who are willing to adapt, innovate, and even make alliances with their oldest enemies. In the year 400 for BCE, a long and devastating conflict, the Peloponnesian War, finally came to an end. Athens, once the jewel of the Aegean, surrendered to its rival Sparta. The terms were harsh. The city's famous long walls, which connected Athens to its vital port of Piraeus, were systematically torn down under the watchful eyes of the victors. A Spartan fleet anchored nearby, a constant reminder of Athenian defeat. All but a handful of Athens' mighty triremes, the warships that had once ruled the seas, were handed over. The great Athenian Empire was no more. With military defeat came political upheaval. Sparta, mistrustful of Athens' radical democracy, supported the installation of a new government. This was not a government of the people, but a commission of 30 appointed officials who would hold absolute power over the city's laws, courts, and administration. History would come to know them simply as the 30. Assuming power late in 400 for BCE, the 30 wasted no time in reshaping the state. They immediately overhauled the administration, suspending the large democratic juries that had been the cornerstone of Athenian justice. In their place, smaller councils loyal to the new regime took control. Public offices, once filled by lottery in a display of civic equality, were now filled by appointment. Power was being concentrated into the hands of a select few. The 30 began rewriting laws and dismissing magistrates who didn't align with their vision. To enforce their rule, armed guards were stationed at strategic points throughout the city, including the sacred Acropolis and the bustling port of Piraeus. While Spartan forces remained in the region, they left the day-to-day running of Athens to their appointed oligarchs. The 30 were now in complete control. One of their first acts was to drastically shrink the citizen body. They drew up a list of just 3,000 men who would be considered full citizens, retaining their political rights. Everyone else, tens of thousands of Athenians, was stripped of their civic privileges. They were now subjects, not participants, in their own city. This was a direct assault on the democratic ideal that had defined Athens for generations. The regime then turned its attention to wealth. Property reviews were conducted, often serving as a pretext for confiscation. The estates of wealthy citizens and political opponents were seized, their assets liquidated or redistributed among the 30 and their supporters. Arrests became common, carried out by officials operating under a new, twisted legal framework where the accused had little hope of a fair trial. Fear began to grip the city, but even in this dark time, the spirit of Athenian freedom was not extinguished. By early 403 BCE, opposition began to stir. Athenian exiles, Democrats, and those who had fled the 30s purge gathered in neighboring territories like Thebes. They were scattered and outnumbered, but they shared a common goal: to reclaim their city. They began to organize, planning their return to Attica by first securing defensible positions along the border. In the harsh winter of 400 for BCE, a small but determined band of exiles, led by a man named Thrasybulus, made their move. They seized the mountain fortress of Philae, a rugged stronghold in the north of Attica. From this high ground, they could see the path back to Athens. Philae became a beacon of resistance, and soon more exiles flocked to join them, swelling their numbers and securing vital supply lines. The 30 could not ignore this growing threat. They dispatched forces to crush the rebellion at Philae, but the mountainous terrain and bitter winter weather favored the defenders. The exiles, fighting for their homes and their freedom, held their ground against the oligarch's army. In a series of skirmishes, they repelled the attacks, their victory at Philae proving that the 30 were not invincible. Emboldened by their success, in early 403 BCE, the rebels marched south. Their target was Piraeus, the port of Athens. It was not only a strategic and commercial hub, but also a democratic stronghold, home to many of the sailors, merchants, and craftsmen who had been disenfranchised by the 30. The rebels seized the hill of Munichia, which overlooked the harbor, giving them a commanding view of the area. The 30's forces moved to dislodge them, and a fierce battle erupted on the slopes of Munichia and in the streets of Piraeus. The fighting was close and brutal. In the struggle, the rebels fought with a desperate courage, and the forces of the 30 began to falter. Critias, the ruthless leader of the 30, was killed in the engagement. His death sent shock waves through the oligarchy. The defeat at Munichia shattered the unity of the 30. The remaining members fractured, and a new, smaller governing body took over in Athens. But they could not retake the port. Now, two powers existed in Attica, the oligarchs clinging to power in the city of Athens, and the democratic government in exile, firmly in control of Piraeus. The stage was set for a civil war. For months, the two sides faced each other. Skirmishes broke out along the roads that connected the city and its port. Hoplite armies maneuvered for position, their movements channeled by the remnants of the city's walls. Control of supply routes became paramount as both factions tried to starve the other into submission. The fate of Athens hung in the balance. Sparta, which had created this crisis, now watched with growing concern. The instability in Athens was not in their interest. Initially, they sent a force to support the oligarchs, but it soon became clear that a military victory would be costly and indecisive. The Spartan king, Pausanias, decided that a negotiated settlement was the only way to restore order. He stepped in to mediate between the two Athenian factions. By late 403 BCE, an agreement was reached. It was a landmark moment of reconciliation. The terms were clear: democracy was to be restored. The exiles would return, and broad civic participation would be reestablished. Crucially, a general amnesty was declared. With a few exceptions for the most notorious leaders of the 30, all past grievances were to be forgiven. This was not about revenge, it was about healing the city. The old democratic institutions were quickly brought back to life. The citizen rolls were expanded, large juries were reinstated, and public officials were once again chosen by established procedures. The public assembly, the heart of the democracy, resumed its meetings. The city began to breathe again, the armed factions demobilized. The rebels in Piraeus and the oligarchic forces in Athens laid down their arms, uniting under the re-established government. The Spartan forces, their work of mediation complete, withdrew from Attica. Athens was once again master of its own destiny. The scars of the conflict remained, the long walls were still in ruins, and the city's naval power was a shadow of its former self. But the legal and political foundations were being rebuilt. Courts began the difficult process of resolving property disputes, guided by the principle of amnesty. In a powerful symbolic act, the terms of the reconciliation were inscribed on stone pillars for all to see, a permanent reminder of their commitment to unity over vengeance. By the end of 403 BCE, Athens had completed its remarkable journey from tyranny back to democracy. In just 1 year, the city had endured foreign domination, oligarchic terror, civil war, and finally, a negotiated peace. The re-establishment of democracy was not a return to the glorious past, but the beginning of a new chapter forged in hardship and tempered by the desire for reconciliation. It stands as a powerful testament to the resilience of the democratic ideal, a story of how a city, pushed to the brink, chose to heal itself and rebuild history. Today, we're stepping into a world fresh off the battlefield, a Greece fundamentally reshaped by decades of brutal conflict. The year is 404 BCE. The Peloponnesian War is finally over. Athens, the vibrant heart of the Delian League, has fallen. And in its place, a new power rises, casting a long shadow across the Aegean: Sparta. This isn't just a story of one city's victory. It's the beginning of a new, turbulent chapter known as the Spartan hegemony. So, how did the Spartans, a society famously resistant to change and foreign entanglement, end up ruling an empire? And what did that rule actually look like? Let's find out. For nearly 30 years, the Greek world had been torn apart by the war between Athens and Sparta. When Athens finally surrendered, the terms were harsh. Their long walls, the symbols of their naval power and defiance, were torn down to the sound of flute music. Their fleet was reduced to a mere 12 ships. Their democratic government was replaced by a brutal oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants, a pro-Spartan regime that unleashed a reign of terror on the Athenian populace. It seemed like Sparta had achieved total victory. Their allies, especially Corinth and Thebes, were ecstatic, with some even demanding that Athens be completely destroyed and its people enslaved. But Sparta's commander, Lysander, had other plans. He was the architect of Sparta's naval victory, a brilliant but ambitious figure who saw an opportunity to build a personal empire. Instead of destroying Athens, he installed the 30 Tyrants, ensuring the city would be a Spartan puppet. This was a pattern he repeated across the former Athenian Empire. In cities all over the Aegean, he dismantled democracies and set up oligarchies loyal to him, often enforced by Spartan garrisons. These ruling councils were called dikarches, groups of 10 local oligarchs who answered directly to Lysander and the local Spartan commander, the Harmost. This new order was a shock to the Greek world. For decades, Athens had been the dominant power, and while its rule was often heavy-handed, it was at least predictable. The tribute they collected fueled their democracy and funded magnificent public works. The Spartan system was different. It was built on raw military power and personal loyalty to Lysander. The tribute didn't flow into a public treasury. It often ended up in the hands of Lysander and his favorites. This created immense resentment, not just among the former subjects of Athens, but also among Sparta's own allies. They had fought to liberate Greece from Athenian tyranny, not to replace it with a Spartan one. Back in Sparta, Lysander's growing power and wealth were causing a stir. Spartan society was built on the ideals of equality among its citizens, austerity, and obedience to the state. Lysander, with his network of loyalists and his vast personal fortune accumulated from the spoils of war, was a direct challenge to this traditional order. The Spartan kings and the ephors, the elected officials who held much of the real power, grew deeply suspicious of him. They saw his personal empire as a threat to the Spartan constitution itself. The tension was palpable. Meanwhile, in Athens, the rule of the 30 tyrants was becoming a catastrophe. Led by Critias, a former associate of Socrates, they executed over 1,000 citizens, confiscated their property, and drove many more into exile. This brutality was too much even for some Spartans. The exiled Athenian Democrats, led by Thrasybulus, found refuge in Thebes, one of Sparta's key allies, who was now growing disillusioned. In 403 BCE, Thrasybulus led a small force of exiles, seized a fort on the border of Attica, and began a guerrilla war against the 30. His forces swelled as more Athenians, sick of the tyranny, flocked to his banner. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Piraeus, where the Democrats defeated the forces of the 30. Critias himself was killed in the fighting. Faced with a full-blown civil war in Athens, the Spartans were divided. Lysander wanted to rush back and crush the Democrats to restore his puppet regime, but his rivals in Sparta, particularly King Pausanias, saw an opportunity to undermine him. Pausanias intervened, but instead of crushing the Democrats, he negotiated a settlement. The 30 tyrants were removed, and democracy was restored in Athens. A general amnesty was declared, a remarkable act of reconciliation aimed at healing the city's wounds. This was a major blow to Lysander's prestige and a clear sign that his influence was waning. The Spartan state had reasserted its control over its ambitious general. With Athens neutralized and Lysander's power checked, Sparta turned its attention eastward to Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The Greek cities there had been promised freedom by Sparta in exchange for Persian gold during the war. Now, the Persian satrap, or governor, Tissaphernes, was trying to bring them back under his control. Sparta, now positioning itself as the protector of Greek liberty, decided to intervene. But there was another, more dramatic, reason for their focus on Persia. This brings us to one of the most incredible stories from this era, the March of the 10,000. In 401 BCE, a young Persian prince named Cyrus the Younger hired a massive army of Greek mercenaries, about 13,000 strong, to help him overthrow his own brother, King Artaxerxes II. Cyrus had been a key ally to Sparta during the Peloponnesian War, providing them with crucial funds. Many of these mercenaries were battle-hardened veterans of that conflict, men with no homes or jobs to return to. They marched deep into the heart of the Persian Empire, where they fought the royal army at the Battle of Cunaxa near Babylon. The Greeks were victorious on their flank, but Cyrus himself was killed in the battle. Suddenly, the 10,000 were stranded. They were over 1,000 miles from home, deep in hostile territory, without the man who had hired them. Their Persian allies deserted them, and their generals were treacherously murdered by Tissaphernes. It seemed like a hopeless situation, but then they did something extraordinary. They elected new leaders, including an Athenian named Xenophon, who would later write a famous account of their journey called the Anabasis. Under his leadership, they fought their way north through deserts and mountains, battling hostile tribes and the pursuing Persian army all the way to the Black Sea. Their cry of Thalata. Thalata, the sea, upon finally seeing the coast, is one of the most famous moments in ancient history. The epic journey of the 10,000 had a profound impact. It demonstrated the clear superiority of Greek hoplite soldiers over the Persian forces. But more importantly, it exposed the weakness and vulnerability of the vast Persian Empire. It showed that a determined Greek army could march right to its heart and back again. This revelation was not lost on the Spartans. Inspired by this and angered by Persian actions in Anatolia, Sparta's king Agesilaus II, a close friend of Lysander, launched a major campaign into Asia Minor. In 396 BCE, Agesilaus was an ambitious and skilled commander, and he dreamed of a grand pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia. His initial campaigns were very successful. He won several victories, liberated Greek cities, and amassed a huge amount of plunder. He seemed on the verge of carving out a permanent Spartan territory in Asia, and perhaps even destabilizing the entire Persian Empire. But back in Greece, the seeds of resentment that Sparta had sown were beginning to sprout. Thebes and Corinth, once Sparta's staunchest allies, were now its most bitter enemies. They were angered by Sparta's arrogant and unilateral actions after the war. Sparta had denied them a share of the spoils and had failed to consult them on major decisions, like the peace with Athens or the war in Asia. They saw Sparta's hegemony not as a protective leadership, but as an oppressive tyranny, just like Athens before it. The Persian king, Artaxerxes, saw his opportunity. While Agesilaus was rampaging through his western provinces, Persian agents were busy in Greece, distributing gold to Sparta's enemies. This gold was the catalyst for a new anti-Spartan alliance. Thebes, Corinth, Athens, and Argos, for major powers, joined forces to challenge Spartan dominance. This conflict, which broke out in 395 BCE, is known as the Corinthian War. The outbreak of the Corinthian War marked the beginning of the end for the Spartan hegemony. Agesilaus was forced to abandon his grand ambitions in Asia and rush back to Greece to defend Sparta itself. The very allies who had helped Sparta win the Peloponnesian War were now arrayed against it, funded by the same Persian gold that had once paid for Sparta's fleet. The period of undisputed Spartan dominance, which had begun with such a decisive victory in 400 for BCE, had lasted less than a decade. The dream of a stable, Spartan-led Greece had dissolved into yet another costly, fratricidal Greek war. Sparta's failure to build a lasting and inclusive peace shows just how difficult it was to rule the fiercely independent city-states of ancient Greece. Their heavy-handed and self-interested policies alienated their friends and empowered their enemies, ultimately leading to the collapse of their own empire. Ever wonder what happens when the victors of a massive war can't agree on the spoils? Well, that's exactly the story of ancient Greece after the Peloponnesian War. Sparta had finally defeated Athens, its longtime rival, becoming the undisputed heavyweight champion of the Greek world. But as they say, it's lonely at the top and heavy is the crown. Sparta's dominance, enforced with an iron fist by its governor-generals or harmosts, quickly turned its former allies into bitter rivals. This simmering resentment was about to boil over into a new, devastating conflict, the Corinthian War. So, picture this: Sparta, fresh off its victory, starts throwing its weight around. Thebes and Corinth, who had fought alongside Sparta, expected a share of the glory and the rewards. Instead, they got the cold shoulder. Sparta was acting like the new school bully, and nobody was happy about it. The final straw came when Sparta decided to punish Elis, another former ally, and then launched a full-scale invasion of Asia Minor to liberate the Ionian Greeks from Persian rule. This move directly provoked the mighty Persian Empire, which had bankrolled Sparta's victory over Athens in the first place. You can almost hear the Persian king saying, "Wait a minute, I helped you win, and now you're attacking my territory." The Persians were not about to let this slide. They were masters of diplomacy and, let's be honest, bribery. A Persian satrap named Pharnabazus started sending bags of gold to the disgruntled Greek city-states. The message was clear: I lines fund your war against Sparta if you cause enough trouble to get them out of my backyard. And boy, did it work! Thebes, Corinth, Athens, and Argos, all harboring their own grudges against Sparta, saw an opportunity. They formed a coalition, a new alliance fueled by Persian gold and a shared hatred of Spartan arrogance. The stage was set for the Corinthian War, which officially kicked off in 395 BCE. The war's name comes from its primary battleground, the lands around the city of Corinth. The initial fighting was brutal. One of Sparta's most brilliant commanders, Lysander, the very man who had engineered the victory over Athens, was killed in an early battle at Haliartus. This was a huge blow to Spartan morale. It showed that the seemingly invincible Spartan war machine could bleed. The allies, emboldened, gathered their forces near Corinth, preparing to block any Spartan advance into central Greece. In response, Sparta recalled its king, Agesilaus, from his successful campaign in Asia Minor. Agesilaus was a formidable general, and his return with a veteran army was a game-changer. He marched his troops back to Greece and, in 390 for BCE, faced the allied army at the Battle of Nemea. It was a classic Greek showdown. The Spartans, as usual, were disciplined and deadly. They crushed the allied forces in a bloody encounter, reasserting their dominance on land. But here's the twist. On the very same day, or close to it, a world away at sea, the Spartan navy was being annihilated. Off the coast of Cnidus in Asia Minor, a combined Persian and Athenian fleet, commanded by the former Athenian general Conon, met the Spartan navy. The Spartans, who were never natural sailors, were completely outmatched. Their entire fleet was captured or destroyed. This single naval victory was monumental. It shattered Sparta as short-lived control of the Aegean Sea and opened the door for Athens to begin rebuilding its maritime power. Conon, flush with Persian funds, sailed back to Athens and began reconstructing the famous Long Walls, the very fortifications Sparta had torn down just a decade earlier. It was a symbolic and strategic resurrection for Athens. With Sparta dominant on land and the allies controlling the sea, the war entered a grueling stalemate. The fighting devolved into a series of raids, sieges, and skirmishes, mostly centered around the Isthmus of Corinth. Both sides were bleeding men and resources, with no clear end in sight. The war dragged on for years, exhausting everyone involved. The constant conflict was devastating the Greek countryside and draining the treasuries of every city-state. Even the Persians, who were footing a large part of the bill, started to get tired of the endless stalemate. The Athenian resurgence, in particular, began to worry the Persian king Artaxerxes II. He had funded Athens to weaken Sparta, not to see it rise again as a powerful empire that could challenge Persian interests in the Aegean. The Athenians were getting a little too successful for his liking. Seeing an opportunity, Sparta sent an envoy, a skilled diplomat named Antalcidas, to negotiate directly with the Persian king. Antalcidas' mission was simple: convince the Persians that a resurgent Athens was a bigger threat than a chastened Sparta. He proposed a deal. Sparta would recognize Persia as control over the Greek cities in Asia Minor, the very cities they had gone to war to liberate, in exchange for Persia as help in ending the war on terms favorable to Sparta. Artaxerxes, seeing the logic in this, agreed. He was tired of funding the war and wanted stability. He decided to broker a peace treaty, but this wouldn't be a negotiation among equals. This would be an edict from the great king himself. In 387 BCE, the Greek states were summoned. The Persian king's decree was read aloud, and it became known as the King's Peace, or the Peace of Antalcidas. The terms were stark. All Greek cities in Asia Minor were to belong to Persia. All other Greek cities, big or small, were to be autonomous or independent. This meant that all leagues and alliances, like the one formed against Sparta, had to be disbanded. The only exception was Sparta's own Peloponnesian League. To enforce this peace, the king appointed Sparta as his policeman, his enforcer in Greece. Any state that violated the terms would face the combined wrath of Sparta and the Persian Empire. The Greek city-states, exhausted by nearly a decade of war, had no choice but to accept. The king's peace officially ended the Corinthian War, but what was the real outcome? On the surface, it seemed like a diplomatic victory for Sparta. They had ended the war and were now the designated guardians of a new political order. But it came at a terrible price. Sparta had sold out their fellow Greeks in Ionia, abandoning them to Persian rule. This was a betrayal of the pan-Hellenic ideal and a stain on Sparta's reputation. Furthermore, the autonomy clause was a double-edged sword. While it broke up the anti-Spartan coalition, it also gave Sparta the justification to interfere in the affairs of any city-state it deemed a threat. Over the next decade, Sparta would use. In 371 BCE, political and military tensions between Thebes and Sparta culminated in renewed armed confrontation. Diplomatic negotiations held earlier that year failed to produce a settlement acceptable to both sides. Spartan authorities mobilized a field army composed of citizen hoplites and allied contingents. The force advanced northward from the Peloponnesus through central Greece and entered Boeotian territory along established land routes. Thebes organized defensive preparations across the plains west of the city, concentrating its forces near the village of Leuctra. Leuctra stood on relatively level ground bordered by low rises. The terrain allowed full hoplite deployment while limiting concealed maneuver. Theban forces assembled with cavalry positioned forward to observe and contest Spartan movement. Infantry units formed behind them, arranged according to a modified tactical plan that departed from evenly distributed depth across the line. The Theban formation placed significantly increased depth on the left wing. Elite hoplite contingents were concentrated within this sector. The center and right wings were drawn up in shallower formation and were positioned slightly behind the weighted left. This arrangement created an oblique alignment relative to the advancing Spartan army. Cavalry units remained forward to disrupt initial contact, while light infantry elements were distributed to guard flanks and maintain formation integrity during the approach. Spartan forces adhered to established practice. Their strongest contingents, including the king Cleombrotus I, were positioned on the right wing. The line advanced in coordinated formation across open ground toward the Theban front. Early contact occurred between mounted units as cavalry from both sides engaged. Theban cavalry pressed forward and disrupted the frontage of the Spartan right before withdrawing toward supporting infantry. As infantry formations closed, the Theban left advanced in concentrated depth toward the Spartan right. The remainder of the Theban line advanced more gradually, maintaining spacing and limiting full engagement outside the primary collision point. When contact was made, hoplite formations locked shields and applied forward pressure. The increased depth of the Theban left produced localized numerical superiority against the Spartan right wing. Sustained frontal force gradually displaced Spartan ranks within that sector. The Spartan center and left continued forward movement, but cohesion along the right weakened under concentrated pressure. Attempts at internal realignment were constrained by close combat conditions and limited maneuver space within the phalanx. Casualties accumulated within the Spartan right-wing contingent. King Cleombrotus I was killed during the engagement. As formation integrity declined, Spartan forces withdrew from the field in organized retreat. The Theban army remained in possession of the battlefield. Spartan losses included a significant proportion of full citizen soldiers. The engagement constituted a documented instance in which a Spartan field army was defeated in direct hoplite confrontation on open terrain by another mainland Greek state. In 370 BCE, Theban forces initiated operations beyond Boeotia. Military movement proceeded southward into the Peloponnesus in coordination with allied contingents. Advancing through Arcadian territory, the coalition entered regions historically under Spartan authority. Routes were selected to avoid fortified concentrations where resistance was strongest. Theban forces crossed into Messenian territory west of the Taygetus Range. Local populations previously administered under Spartan control were reorganized under new civic structures. Defensive sites were secured, and logistical corridors were maintained through coordinated troop placement. In 369 BCE, a fortified urban center was established at Messini-on-Tome. Defensive walls were constructed around the settlement perimeter. Population consolidation occurred through organized relocation of inhabitants from surrounding districts. Agricultural land within the region was redistributed under the authority of the new civic administration. The formation of Messini created an independent political entity separate from Spartan governance. During the same period, Arcadian communities formed a federal structure centered at Megalopolis. Defensive planning emphasized collective security, and fortifications were constructed accordingly. Theban forces supported these developments while maintaining readiness in Boeotia and along routes connecting central Greece to the Peloponnesus. Spartan mobilization within Laconia remained limited during this phase. No decisive counteroffensive displaced the newly established Messenian state. Territorial control west of the Taygetus remained outside Spartan administration following these operations. The tactical deployment used at Leuctra demonstrated concentrated depth applied against a selected sector of an opposing phalanx. The arrangement differed from evenly distributed hoplite lines commonly employed in earlier engagements. Contemporary records identified the engagement as a departure from established deployment symmetry within Greek warfare. Between 371 and 369 BCE, the distribution of military manpower and territorial control in southern Greece changed measurably. Spartan citizen losses at Leuctra reduced available field strength for subsequent large-scale engagements. Control of Messenian territory, previously integrated into Spartan economic and military structures, transferred to an independent administration centered at Messene. Thebes maintained operational presence in Boeotia while supporting allied structures in Arcadia and Messenia. By 369 BCE, central and southern Greece reflected altered territorial boundaries and revised alliance alignments. The sequence of mobilization, battlefield engagement at Leuctra, and subsequent Peloponnesian operations collectively reconfigured the balance of power among the principal mainland Greek states. Segment 14, Macedonian Ascendancy and the Battle of Chaeronea 339-336 BCE. In 339 BCE, tensions between Phocis and the Amphictyonic Council escalated into armed conflict. The council, which oversaw the central Greek sanctuary of Delphi, imposed sanctions on Phocis for its occupation of territory in the Amphissa region. Phocian forces resisted, prompting intervention by neighboring city-states. The situation drew the attention of Philip II of Macedon, who mobilized his army to assert influence in central Greece and protect Macedonian interests. Philip II assembled forces in Macedonia, including heavy infantry arranged in phalanx formation, light infantry units, and cavalry divisions. Logistical preparations involved provisioning for sustained movement through Thessaly and into Boeotia. Supply convoys followed established routes along the Enipeus River and the passes connecting northern Thessaly to central Greek plains. Macedonian units moved in coordinated columns, securing river crossings and fortified points along the route. The army occupied strategic hills and ridges en route to Chaeronea to maintain control of the surrounding territory. By mid-339 BCE, intelligence reports indicated that Athens and Thebes were preparing to mobilize contingents in support of the Phocian position. Athens dispatched hoplite units and supporting light infantry from the Piraeus and surrounding districts, while Thebes positioned forces along the Boeotian plain near Chaeronea. Reconnaissance missions were conducted to assess terrain suitability for phalanx deployment. The battlefield consisted of open plains bordered by low hills, interspersed with cultivated fields and river terraces. Roads connecting Chaeronea to adjacent Boeotian settlements were observed to be suitable for the rapid movement of heavy infantry and cavalry formations. In the summer of 338 BCE, Greek allied forces completed concentration near Chaeronea. The allied army positioned Theban contingents, including the Sacred Band, on one flank with Athenian units aligned opposite Macedonian forces. Command coordination involved maintaining contiguous lines between city contingents. Defensive positions were prepared along minor elevations, and supply arrangements ensured access to water sources and forage for cavalry mounts. Macedonian forces advanced from the north and northeast, establishing lines on gently sloping terrain that allowed for both phalanx engagement and cavalry deployment. The engagement commenced in August 338 BCE. Macedonian infantry moved into formation along the southern approach to Chaeronea. Philip II assumed command of one wing, while Alexander, acting as subordinate commander, led the companion cavalry on the opposite wing. Infantry formations advanced in echelon alignment, maintaining cohesion across the line. Cavalry units executed flanking maneuvers designed to maintain pressure on the edges of the opposing formations. The Allied forces held position along the northern and western sectors, with Theban hoplites arranged in compact formations and Athenian hoplites extending along the adjacent plains. Light infantry units skirmished along the margins, occupying farm tracts and shallow ravines. During the engagement, Macedonian forces executed coordinated movement to close with the Allied line. Infantry phalanxes engaged in direct contact with the Theban and Athenian hoplites. Cavalry units maneuvered along open terrain, targeting areas where Allied formations were less dense. Recorded outcomes indicate that Theban contingents, including the Sacred Band, were encircled and suffered complete destruction. The Athenian hoplite line was breached, and organized withdrawal commenced under pressure from advancing Macedonian phalanxes. The Allied army disengaged and retreated toward Boeotian interior positions. Following the battle, Macedonian units advanced to secure key locations across Boeotia. Thebes was occupied, and Macedonian garrisons were installed to maintain control of strategic points within the city. Administrative measures were recorded, including the placement of overseers to supervise the city council and maintain local order. Fortifications within Thebes were inspected and reinforced to accommodate a permanent garrison. Adjacent Boeotian settlements came under Macedonian influence, with recorded arrangements for tribute collection and monitoring of roadways connecting Chaeronea, Thespia, and Tanagra. In Athens, officials convened to determine the terms of settlement. Athenian forces, having withdrawn in an organized manner, retained possession of peripheral territories. Negotiations with Macedonian representatives established political agreements that preserved internal governance while recognizing Macedonian military dominance. Maritime patrols and the provisioning of hoplite units continued along the Piraeus to Athens corridor to ensure security and supply continuity. During 337 BCE, representatives from multiple Greek city-states convened at Corinth to formalize a collective arrangement. Member states included Athens, Thebes, Thessaly, and the Peloponnesian allies. Macedonian leadership was recognized as hegemonic within the alliance. Formal provisions delineated responsibilities for coordinated military readiness, oversight of regional security, and participation in campaigns under Macedonian command. Administrative documentation included ratification of alliance terms and instructions for the rotation of magistrates responsible for reporting troop movements to Central Council authorities. Following the Corinthian assembly, Macedonian forces conducted inspections of road networks and strategic passes connecting northern Thessaly, central Boeotia, and southern Phocis. Supply lines were maintained to support potential future campaigns. Cavalry patrols monitored local movement along river valleys, while phalanx formations conducted drill operations in open fields to preserve unit cohesion. Recorded troop deployments indicate a rotation of Macedonian detachments across hilltop positions, maintaining control of terrain without large-scale engagement. In 336 BCE, Philip II traveled to Asia to conduct routine administrative oversight and religious observances. During this period, arrangements for continued Macedonian supervision of allied territories were codified. In the palace precincts of Asia, records note appointments of regional governors, allocation of garrison forces, and documentation of tribute obligations from Greek city-states. No battlefield operations were recorded during this interval. Philip II was assassinated in the course of ceremonial proceedings. Authority was transferred to Alexander, his designated successor, who assumed command of both military and administrative structures. Following the succession, Alexander consolidated Macedonian authority over previously occupied territories. Military units in Boeotia and Thessaly were inspected, and supply depots were maintained to ensure continuity of operational readiness. Administrative oversight of Thebes and Corinthian council arrangements continued, with Macedonian representatives observing local governance and supervising garrison forces. Documentation records the installation of Macedonian commanders to oversee strategic positions, including fortified passes and main roadways connecting central Greece to Macedonia. Throughout this period, Greek city-states retained nominal autonomy within Macedonian oversight. Athens maintained internal administrative structures, and Thebes operated under garrison supervision. Financial and logistical arrangements were documented for Macedonian provisioning of garrisons, including food stores, armament depots, and cavalry forage. Roads and river crossings were maintained to facilitate movement of troops and supplies. Maritime channels between Athens, Piraeus, and adjacent islands continued to operate under coordinated monitoring by Allied officials and Macedonian oversight personnel. Recorded outcomes of the Macedonian ascendancy included the cessation of organized coalition resistance in central Greece, establishment of Macedonian hegemony over the Boeotian plain, and recognition of Philip II and later Alexander as leaders of the Corinthian League. Military structures, garrison placements, and supply arrangements were documented, providing continuity of operational capability. No further hostilities were recorded in the immediate region following Alexander's assumption of authority. Administrative acts extended to the establishment of Macedonian oversight over Phocis, Tanagra, and Thebes. Positions for military commanders, tax collection, and civic coordination were documented. Road networks, river crossings, and fortified locations were maintained to facilitate troop movement and supply distribution. Coastal regions, including Piraeus and adjacent islands, were monitored to maintain maritime communication and transportation routes. Alexander's succession in 336 BCE concluded the documented sequence of military and administrative developments following the Battle of Chaeronea. Recorded actions include the transfer of Macedonian command structures, continuation of garrison supervision, inspection of logistical networks, and enforcement of alliance provisions ratified at Corinth. Administrative continuity was maintained without additional structural adjustments beyond those recorded in primary source. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history and want more carefully researched documentaries like this one, make sure to subscribe and follow the channel. New episodes explore major battles, empires, and turning points in world history presented with clear narration and accurate detail.